Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about Skaven in Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and why they are one of the best races in the game. They do have a couple of issues, but for the most part, Skaven are an incredibly powerful race on the campaign map that can dominate that campaign map in a way few others can. Think of Dark Elves, Greenskins, etc. So Skaven are certainly a top tier race. But what makes them so? What makes the Skaven so very powerful? Well, one of the things I would mention is that their campaign variety is actually quite great. So a campaign as Snitch, which I have here, is going to be a very different campaign than what you have as Ikakla in terms of campaign mechanics, in terms of the types of units you're going to focus on, the objectives you're going to focus on, how you're just overall going to play. And then a campaign as Ikakla is going to be wildly different than a campaign as Throt. And also, you have variety even in the baseline legendary lords like Skrulk and Queek, who play very different campaigns. And we're not just talking here about terrain or which side of the map they're on. No, I'm talking here campaign mechanics. Certainly, the DLC lords do stand head and shoulders above of the baseline lords, but even with the baseline lords, you do have a good amount of power in each of them, well, with the exception of Tretch, but Tretch is Tretch. But with Skrulk and Queek, you do have a good degree of power for both of them, but at the same time having two different campaigns that you're playing there. Then with the DLC lords, completely different situation, major differences in the way those campaigns are played. Now, in terms of the Skaven themselves, well, one of the things that makes them powerful is the way they take over settlements. So, when you win through a settlement, obviously you can sack it, which I did over here, but when you take over a settlement, you can't just occupy it, you loot and occupy it. Now, there's a high chance that if you're taking a province like this, like I just did over here, you're going to get a rebellion shortly thereafter. Though, getting a rebellion just as soon as you finish capturing a province is not necessarily a bad idea because it's free experience and money, which is not really a downside. But for Skaven, they have the food mechanic, which gives them either significant negatives or pretty decent bonuses. In particular, they'll get a good amount of control, they'll get a good amount of leadership in their territory or ally territory, and that growth will really help them out. Now, you spend food mainly to get settlements to a higher level, and you instantly get these settlements to a higher level, which in itself does grant you a significant amount of power. Because right here, I suddenly have a tier 3 settlement at turn 4, and with this tier 3 settlement, what I'm going to do is get an arcane generators building and start getting certain unit recruitment, so like engineer recruitment as an example, and maybe even start getting the weapon dump, or if I just want to get heroes as quickly as possible, I would go for the client pit. Though I'm probably not going to do so right now. Instead, what I would probably do is just get a control building to keep things under control and get those other buildings later on. Being able to get settlements to a higher level very, very quickly in a campaign does confer to you a fairly significant advantage in of itself. Not only does this mean that you have a greater unit variety in terms of the units you can recruit from the very beginning. In fact, I might just go with the weapons dump really over here and worry about the control building in another settlement. Not only does this confer a significant advantage to you, but because of the way the Skaven economy works, you do want to actually construct these building varieties. So that means when you're playing any Skaven campaign, you will have, assuming you own the DLC, but even without DLC, you do have a fairly strong variety of units that you can actually use on the campaign. Though, to be certain, Skaven are certainly one of those races where the DLC is very much worth the price, and it's very good what the DLC is going to give them. Some of the DLC units are incredibly powerful, some of the strongest that the race has to offer. Though, to be clear, you can certainly play Skaven even without any of the DLC, and they'll just be less crazy than they are with the DLC. But, like, looking at this situation over here, I'm getting two different buildings for unit recruitment. Obviously, one is for artillery, though mainly I'm getting it for the engineer, not the plague claws. Though you can also get Doom Wheels or Doom Flayers and then eventually Doom Wheels. Then another building that's going to allow me to get Rattling Gunners, Jezzails, Poison Wind Mortars, Globadiers, Bombardiers, all that. So a good amount of power. Then I already built an Assassin Hideout. So I'm being able to recruit Gutter Runners at this point in the campaign, which in itself is a good amount of power. Though getting Assassin's Hideout at the Tier 2 settlement is something exclusive to Snitch, but I would still be able to recruit Night Runners as any other Legendary Lord of the Skaven. And at this point, I already have 3 heroes, the one I started with, 2 assassins that are recruited. And one of the things that really stands out for a Skaven, not only do they have a very strong variety in terms of their unit recruitment, they also have a strong variety of heroes that they can recruit fairly easily, because their hero capacity can be increased very, very easily. So when we're looking at Skaven Chieftains, all you need to do is get a Tier 2 barracks, get us in minor settlements, get a ton of Chieftains. They're decent melee fighters, certainly not the best, obviously, but quantity is a quality of its own. So you get a lot of Skaven Chieftains, which give you training and are decent melee fighters. You get a ton of assassins through every hidden layer. So you can get generally this building is Tier 2. So for every other Legendary Lord except Snitch, it's Tier 2. But you end up getting a bunch of hidden layers, and you can actually end up getting a significant amount of Plague Priests and Eshin Sorcerers. Now you might think, oh, it requires Tier 4. Well, it's pretty easy one for Skaven to get to Tier 4, but not quite. There's an ancillary that also increases capacity for Plague Priests and Eshin Sorcerers. In fact, the capacity that you would have for Plague Priests and Eshin Sorcerers might be the highest of any particular hero type that you would have. So you might be running around with more Plague Priests and Eshin Sorcerers than any other hero you have. And then finally, you have the pits of the Packmasters, which give you hero capacity for Packmasters. So a significant level of power that the Skaven have, a significant level of variety, a significant number of heroes. Hero stacking works with the Skaven. Getting varied armies works with the Skaven, which is just well and good because some of the baseline units they can recruit from settlements are some of the worst in the game. But they more than make up for this with the wide variety of units that they can recruit from pretty early on in a campaign. Get yourself a provincial capital, put it to Tier 3, and unleash the hordes of the Skaven. Now, the Skaven have pretty powerful growth in their campaign. Their basic growth building goes all the way to 40 growth. And given the way the Skaven economy works, you will probably want to get this, quite a few of these in point of fact in settlements. And in fact, you would get other buildings as well, sure, but getting a lot of these growth buildings is a good way to go. So not only can you get settlements to Tier 3 instantly, or even Tier 5 if you have enough food, though getting a huge amount of food can end up being an issue. But not only can you get settlements to a very high level, but you can also grow these settlements, even if you're taking them at Tier 1, and that is one of the downsides of the Skaven, that if you don't spend food, you will take settlements at Tier 1. But even if you start at Tier 1, you can easily grow a province very quickly to a high level. And it's not like Skaven structures are necessarily that expensive. Yes, provincial capitals can obviously cost quite a bit, but other buildings are incredibly cheap, like Rattling Warrens, 300, Rubbish Pit, 300. Some buildings obviously do cost, the unit recruitment buildings can cost you a bit, but a lot of the buildings don't, and that's really what is important to understand here about the Skaven. Now, the way their economy works is that every single building that they construct gives some level of economy. The types of buildings and the amount of money they give, like obviously recruitment buildings are going to generate you less money than infrastructure buildings, right? But the thing about all of this is that when you get all these buildings, each of them producing some level of income, you then get the arcane generators all the way to the warpstone reactor. So you end up in a situation where you get a lot of these smaller buildings that give you some money, and then you get the reactor or generators that improve the income by up to 50%. So suddenly you end up with a significant amount of money in your campaign if you're playing Skaven. Like, this province is easily going to reach over 3k once I'm done constructing things, maybe even higher than that. Now, To be sure, there is a downside with this system, and it's a major downside dependent on which campaign you're playing and which part of the campaign map you're dealing with. And that, of course, is the fact that you do need provinces with at least 3 settlements in order to make this work. Like, in order to generate some decent level of money. Of course, even in provinces that have 2 settlements, you can still generate a decent amount of income, but Skaven certainly prioritize provinces with 3+ settlements in them in order to really make them work economically. This has been one of the problems that someone like Vlad has had to deal with. Now, Skaven Blight for Ikakla is, of course, an exception because it's got a lot of building slots, and as a result of that, it's not as much of an issue. But to be sure, Skaven in general do want these kind of provinces with 3+ settlements. Now, furthermore, beyond that, like beyond just getting a ridiculous level of growth for buildings, for commandments, for food, also having a decent level of control, which they'll need considering, Skaven corruption does reduce your level of control. Beyond being able to control rebellions, or control rebellions in the sense that you will probably get the most rebellions of any particular race in the game, but at the same time, you can keep those rebellions under control because you can make it so that when a rebellion is starting where you want it, more or less. And that is certainly a good level of power and something that you can take advantage of. And you also get a commandment, the dominating scheme, that gives you even more growth, more control, reduces recruitment cost, and generates food per turn. Getting food generation can be a significant level of power. Research tree, pretty decent enough, though you do need to get certain buildings in order to unlock some of the research, but there is certainly a good degree of power over here when we're looking at the research tree. And the Skaven do get a good amount of replenishment because they have access to assassins, which give them replenishment. They have some of the highest replenishment of any race in the game. Now, the downside of the Skaven is that while their armies are certainly powerful, they're not armies that are so great when it comes to auto-resolve. The reason is the auto-resolve cares heavily about armor when it comes to its damage calculation, so Skaven armies will generally, if you're playing Skaven, you will probably have to end up fighting more manual battles than any other race. To be sure, there is a way of making Skaven armies that are quite resistant to damage and do well in auto-resolve. So things like combination of warp grinders, warp fire throwers, basically everything down the arsenal tree will give you armies that have high levels of armor, decent level of armor at least, and as a result of that, you can auto-resolve quite well with that, or just the hero spamming with that. That is one of the downsides. Another downside that the Skaven do have is that the Skaven slaves, so if we look at the unit roster of Skaven, the Skaven slaves are pretty worthless as units. Like Skaven slaves with spears, Skaven slaves, like the only one you'd recruit, like the only one you might want to recruit are Skaven slaves, Skaven slave slingers. Furthermore, their basic barracks chain, the client pit, the only worth this has for any campaign, including Dredge, which does get benefits to Storm Vermin. The only real benefit you have here, though you certainly can use Storm Vermin to have some heavily armored units, but they're too much on the expensive side to really make use of them, like compared to Poison Wind, Glabadiers, Warp Grinders, and all that. I would personally not bother with Storm Vermin. I think they're too expensive to bother in a campaign, and they're not as great. Like, that's one of the problems. Like, the entire barracks chains, the melee units that they have there, they're just really bad melee units. They don't have great stats. They don't have great durability. They have good speed. That's the only thing that they really have going for them. But that's really all there is to say about it. Just not a good level of power. 9 runners, gutter runners, artillery, monstrous units, different discussion altogether, of course. Good amount of power over there. And it does end up working quite well. Just you have good specialist units, but your basic units are pretty terrible. So you do focus on getting specialist units as quickly as possible. Now, thankfully, the Skaven do have great specialist units, and an elite Skaven army will decimate many opponents that they will encounter in a campaign. Now, what you decide to focus on may be dependent on the campaign. Of course, someone like Ikalclaw is going to focus more on weapon team. Someone like Snitch is going to focus more on Night Runners, Gutter Runners. Someone like Front is going to focus more on Beasts, and so on and so forth. but you get the idea of the Skaven. It's like basic units suck, but specialists are great. Artillery is good. You got also the power of the weapon team, so like things like the poison wind mortars are ridiculous in terms of the damage they do. It might not seem like, oh, the missile strength is that high, but you have multiple projectiles that are fired by these poison wind mortars, and they also do damage over time, and most of the damage is armor piercing. So these guys wipe out entire units, and let's not even talk about the bombardiers, what they can do. So the power for a Skaven is there, regardless of what it may take to access it. It may be harder to access it, like you won't instantly access it as you would in certain other races, at least in certain campaigns. Like it takes a while for Fraud to get going, for instance, in Immortal Empires. But once he gets going, once all of them get going, it's very difficult to stop them. I'm sure anyone that's played against the Skaven knows what I'm talking about if we're talking about legendary difficulty where you're facing the hordes of enemies. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Questin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more. Just a final mention. The Skaven have great climate suitability, which also helps them out because it means they can take a significant portion of the campaign map without any real negatives. Like, consider Snitch over here. The only unpleasant territory is Frozen and Chaotic Wasteland, which means he can still take it. But then he's got Temperate, Mountains, Wasteland, so the vast majority of the map is suitable for the Skaven. Only really Ulthuan stands as a major portion of the campaign map that the Skaven can't really thrive in. And that is really the exception. Well, also the magical forests.